Howdy y'all, welcome back. Today, we're going to dive into another key piece of American history. We're going to be looking at Atlantic City, the so-called Atlantis of the East Coast of America. Now, Atlantic City is almost exclusively known for its casinos, but the history here is chocked full of some really eccentric looking buildings and architecture, as well as a narrative that is ever questionable. So let us begin by looking at the oldest photographs of Atlantic City and trying to understand the sheer magnitude of travelers who would visit Atlantic City on a yearly basis, really from the 19th century onwards. By the year 1874, for example, 500,000 vacationers traveled to Atlantic City just by the way of the railroad. That's not counting the hundreds of thousands that also came by boat, horse, cart, carriage, etc. Almost purposefully, it seems, in the narrative, the initial growth of Atlantic City is kept quiet. The remote nature of Atlantic City amongst a series of isolated pieces of land, also along some treacherous coastline, made for Atlantic City being one of the most remote and isolated retreats in early American history. And the founding of Atlantic City as a tranquil summer escape is today believed to not tie back to the Europeans, but it actually dates back to the Lenape. However, precise information about the Lenape occupation of Atlantic City is scarce, and it is believed that hunting, fishing, and gathering of valuable materials only found near the sea is why Atlantic City was chosen as the summer retreat for the Lenape. However, we also don't have very much information on how active or in-depth the colony of the Lenape was within Atlantic City before the arrival of European settlers, which makes for the initial onslaught of architecture that we see in the first images of Atlantic City very questionable. Did the Lenape help build out these miraculous structures, like moths to a light? It's a debate that is often attached to every video that I make regarding true American history or indigenous history in the Americas. But what we do know is that within years of the first permanent stone house that was occupied by a European, constructed in 1783 in Atlantic City, according to this narrative, from that point forward, Atlantic City was almost immediately transformed into the Mecca for leisure within America, and it was quite literally the most famous resort town in America during the mid to late 19th century. Indeed, these current narrative details are rather fascinating. For example, by 1850, we're told Atlantic City was the most rapidly growing resort town in America, and yet, at that time, it did not have a proper name or even a proper ruling body. It was only 3 years later, in 1853, after a multitude of large resorts were already founded, that the land was given the name of Atlantic City, and this seemed to coincide with the founding of a massive commercial hotel known as the Bellow House. What I find to be so fascinating about this is that the Bellow House and many of the other earliest resorts and hotels in Atlantic City, they were all being built, they were being founded in Atlantic City without really the essentials of a city being in place. We did not have a road to the mainland at this time. The railroad had not even reached Atlantic City when a multitude of these original hotels were being founded. And when we look at the photographs, we can see that mostly all of them were being built with at least stone foundations, if not the entire building being built out of brick or stone. So it's absolutely miraculous to me that we have architecture like this that was popping up seemingly so easily in Atlantic City before the amenities of a city were truly in place. By 1854, just 1 year after being officially founded, Atlantic City was incorporated as the city of New Jersey. And furthermore, it's so interesting how these dates always match up. But also in 1854, the railroad reached Atlantic City for the first time with the Camden and Atlantic Railroad, which ran directly along the oceanfront, connecting the remote parcel of land which houses Atlantic City to Philadelphia, which was the second largest city in America at that time. Alas, also in 1854, construction began on the Absecon Lighthouse in Atlantic City. the tallest lighthouse in New Jersey at 171 feet tall, still standing today, and the third tallest masonry lighthouse in all of America. Being over 160 years old when this lighthouse was founded, as with many of the earliest structures in Atlantic City, we can see such an obvious attention to detail that somehow seemed to radiate throughout every piece of architecture in the city. We're told the first boardwalk in America, the boardwalk in Atlantic City, was completed in 1870, mostly to keep sand out of the newly founded resort hotels. And furthermore, the founding of the boardwalk coincided with the construction of the first connecting road connecting Atlantic City to the mainland, which was also completed in 1870. So again, just to be clear here, up until 1854, you quite literally had to cut through wilderness just to make it to Atlantic City. Seemingly, the only way to get there was by boat. And yet, for almost 100 years prior to 1854, we have Atlantic City being occupied, and it was considered to be one of the most rapidly growing resort towns in the world. By 1854, it was only the railroad which would take you to Atlantic City, and otherwise, again, you were basically left to your own devices if you wanted to get to this American getaway. Do you begin to see why all of the architecture appears so lavish and immense, almost as if it's laughing in the face of those who would come after? Whether this was founded under those auspices or not, we can only imagine what sort of crowds, events, people, history occurred when Atlantic City was more of a secretive getaway for the elite rather than a well-known vacation town for all. But I digress. Either way, it wasn't until 1870 that truly the first road you could travel by horse or carriage was completed, leading to Atlantic City. So again, just imagine how all of this architecture, all of these buildings, the stone masonry, could have been constructed in Atlantic City before the year 1870. When the only means of travel to the city was rail or by sea. We're told by the year 1878, a second railroad was completed to accommodate travelers in and out of Atlantic City, which saw an estimated 1 million visitors or more per year. At this time, 1878, we're also told that every block along the waterfront contained resort hotels, many of which were considered to be of the finest quality in the world at that time, including the United States Hotel, which was said to have taken up at least one entire city block between Atlantic, Pacific, Delaware, and Maryland avenues. In 1883, saltwater taffy was invented in Atlantic City. By the turn of the century into the 20th, Atlantic City quite literally had the largest resort hotel in the entire world, the Traymore Hotel. Let's just briefly look at this building, and let's try to give you an example of just how large this building truly was, how it was almost impossible to imagine that this hotel sat on the edge of the ocean. The Traymore Hotel, said to be named for the owner's favorite town in Ireland and not for the three Moorish-style domes, Traymore, which adorned the top of the massive structure. It was 24 floors tall, except each floor was significantly larger than what we might be accustomed to today. What's wild is that in the photographs of the Traymore that survive, just to give you an idea of the sheer size and magnitude of this hotel, next to the Traymore, we have a little bitty building, which some might mistake as a small offshoot of the Traymore. But this is actually a separate hotel known as the Madison Hotel. And remarkably, the Madison Hotel still stands today. Now, comparing how the Traymore quite literally dwarfs the Madison Hotel in these photographs, and then when we look at the Madison Hotel today, we can see that the Madison Hotel is actually very large, and it makes the cars next to it look very tiny. So comparatively speaking, looking at the Madison, looking at the size of the car compared next to the Madison, and looking at the Traymore and how the Traymore makes the Madison Hotel look tiny, we can only imagine how massive the Traymore really is. The Madison is roughly 150 feet tall at 13 floors. The Traymore is 24 floors. And then looking at the photographs here of the Traymore next to the Madison, we can only begin to make a rough estimate that the Traymore was most likely about 200 feet tall, with the towers then reaching about 300 feet tall or more. And considering the domes on top of the two tallest towers, we could be looking at a structure that was at least 325 feet tall at its apex. We're told the Traymore Hotel began as a boarding house, yet even in the oldest photographs, it has a stone-pillared and archway-formed base, not just wood or simple throwaway designs as the narrative describes. We're told the Traymore had over 450 rooms by 1898, before it was even expanded. Again, sources here vary wildly, but to compete with the nearby Marlborough Blenheim Hotel, also a masterpiece of architecture and engineering, we're told the Traymore was expanded into the skyscraper by the sea, considered to be the first skyscraper in Atlantic City, becoming the centerpiece to the city and the largest resort hotel in the entire world. And this expansion began in 1914. The Traymore featured 4 faucets in every bathtub, hot and cold water, as well as hot and cold ocean water. There was also a 5th faucet in the sink for ice cold water. It may have had over 1,000 rooms by the time the expansion was finished, with parking for over 500 people. Did you know that during World War II, the entirety of the Atlantic City Boardwalk, including 47 resort hotels, including the Traymore, were forcibly taken over by the United States military to form an Air Force base of operations known as Camp Boardwalk? The Traymore became the secret historical hospital for Camp Boardwalk, housing patients until June of 1946. Quite literally, the United States government confiscated pretty much the entirety of Atlantic City, and what they did during this time is really anyone's guess. The Traymore was then imploded and destroyed in 1972. The remains were further hidden when historic Illinois Avenue, the street on which the Traymore was historically known to be located, had its name changed to Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. When we look at Atlantic City, we also cannot go without mentioning that Monopoly, one of the greatest games in American history, a game that helped to define the early 20th century. This game was based around Atlantic City, with one of the key pieces being Illinois Avenue. And when we look at the Traymore Hotel today, basically there is nothing left of these foundations. It was all covered over and turned into parking garages. While historically an indigenous landscape, Atlantic City was Lenape controlled, at least according to the narrative we have now. However, early Atlantic City architecture, at least photographically, was filled with Moorish-style buildings. Now, whether that's a sign of the times or something deeper, we then have, by the early 1900s, many diverse groups which called Atlantic City home were then subjugated and ostracized. African Americans mostly lived in areas on Mediterranean Avenue, while the Slavic people lived on Baltic Avenue. In many local hotels, Atlantic City schools, as well as on the beaches, there was an overall attempt to silence the true history, and these locations were often segregated. Much of the history is only now beginning to come to the limelight. But that's also what I wanted to talk to you about today. I visited Atlantic City over this past weekend. There is not a lot that is left. I went to Martin Luther King Boulevard, the former Illinois Avenue, and I attempted to find the remains of the Traymore, but it's simply not there. It has been completely filled in by parking garages and small shops. The Ripleys, believe it or not. One of my favorite attractions at Atlantic City when I visited here over 20 years ago as a child is no longer there. But the building still sits completely empty, abandoned, almost looking overgrown. Just like so many other buildings along the Atlantic City boardwalk. Really, the only business that I felt that I could see was thriving in any capacity were the casinos. And that's truly a shame when we look at the history and the architecture of the city of the Atlantic, because this really has so much to offer. And I wish we could still see these massive hotels like the Traymore. But I guess that's something that died along with the old world.